Good morning, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to another Coffee and Something Stronger. We have a really special show this morning. My name is Codi. I am the Executive Director of Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. Coffee and Something Stronger is a coffee chat style interview show where we sit down with faith leaders, practitioners, and academics to talk at the intersections of faith, climate justice, and environmental justice. And this morning we have on an incredibly special guest. I'm so excited, Rev Chebon Kernell, a member of the traditional ceremonial ground from Eastern Oklahoma. Reverend, thank you for being with us this morning.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to connect with the community.
So before we dive in and get started, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of the special role that you occupy?
Yeah, and I kind of represent two different kind of cosmologies or areas. Like, I don't even know where to start. By vocation, I am an official. I'm ordained in the United Methodist Church, and I've worked with our Native American and really our Indigenous peoples work and social justice movements across the world for the past almost 10 years now. But also how I identify is I'm a traditional practitioner of our ceremonial ways for our Muscogee Creek and Seminole peoples. And so we still have what just loosely labeled as stomp dance culture. And so we're practitioners, my family, in different ways. That's how we I guess, for lack of a better term, that's how we worship. I kind of live in this sort of duality of navigating both worlds.
Could you talk a little bit about your faith background and kind of how those two things blend together?
Yeah, and I don't even know, like, I get that question a lot, like, how do we reconcile each other? And I think the simple answer that I share is that I don't really think they do at times. One of the, to just start off, is that I really was kind of born into the Christian faith. When we look back historically across the development of what is now the United States, that different regions, different portions of this country were kind of divvied out to various denominations, various Christian groups, the Catholic Church, different denominations. And for us here that were removed and displaced to Oklahoma, we kind of had two main denominations that were given charge over this area. That was the Southern Baptist community and also the Methodist community. So therefore, we had Methodist churches just right down the street from our, what we would call, allotment lands. And that's really how it was introduced into the family 3 generations ago, that my grandmother participated in that church. And so went on my mother, and then that's kind of how I was born into it. And so I was raised up with that particular influence, I guess you could say. But also, I'm very thankful that my grandfather was a traditional leader as well. And so without even knowing it, they lived in that world too, understanding who they were created as. And so my grandfather was one of our leaders of one of our ceremonial grounds. And so therefore I was always exposed to it. I always knew that it was there. I was surrounded by those varying cosmologies, so to speak. And I'm thankful for that, because I know it wasn't an easy time to exist. But today, it kind of puts me in a situation where I started out many years ago. I think it's about 2 decades ago, maybe a little bit more, wanting to listen to a calling that I had to serve my understanding of God at the time in the church. And as time went on, I realized, as I got my, I have a Master of Divinity degree, that as I started to study the history of the development of what became Christianity, I quickly realized that something wasn't quite adding up in terms of the history of the church, but also the faith that we were allowed to have as Indigenous peoples on this continent. I quickly determined that several things were predetermined for us. And it just so happened to conveniently connect to the displacement of our peoples, the usage of the resources that we were governing at the time. And I thought, how convenient was that for this message to be altered? And there's several sermons and several conferences that I've talked at over the years that kind of unpack what that means. But in all simplicity, when we look at some of the first movements of what became Christianity, it was a movement that promoted wellness and equality amongst the diversity of humanity of their known world, and making sure everyone had the right to exist. For some reason, that altered tremendously as it gravitated towards what is North America and the United States. So as I noticed that, I quickly said, wait a second, I have to spend more time, energy, making sure I don't contribute to that cycle of displacement. And at that point, like I said, it's been a couple of decades, I started doing everything in my power to absorb, promote, defend our way of life as Indigenous peoples. And so that's kind of how I raised my children. So hopefully that they won't know that level of violence that I've known through history. And today we're doing the best that we can to thrive in our culture.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, before we get too far into the interview, I mean, exactly what you said kind of connects to when we were talking and decided to do this interview, that Atlanta's honored to host you and other Muscogee people this week for the upcoming Stop Dance in the South River Forest on November 27th. Everyone, there's a link in this video where you can get more information on that this coming Saturday. And I wanted to say that we recognize the lands surrounding the South River and the forest are ancestral Muscogee lands, and the harms of settler colonialism and white supremacy manifested in the people of these lands, Muscogee and Cherokee, being coerced and forcibly removed in so many ways. And the development of Top City on these lands echoes and multiplies those violences, exactly kind of what you're talking about. So it's interesting how there's the background that echoes this, and then the thing that we're talking about this week echoes that as well. And so I wonder if you could talk about, being a reverend and a minister in a tradition that is so heavily rooted in colonialism, or at least the expression of that faith traditionally in the United States has been with that lens, and then trying to go about this process of creating a world in which you can live and thrive. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that complexity.
Yeah, no, I think first and foremost, it's under my opinion, just because of what I've seen. And even several years ago, I worked with our missionary entity of the United Methodist Church, which we're not the largest denomination out there, but we're very big, even though we're approaching a schism right now. And so we had an impact all across the world. And so I speak with that experience, is that I still believe that the Christian faith coupled alongside colonization is probably one of the biggest entities that have done violence to Indigenous peoples. And I still believe that today. I tell people when they ask me to come and speak or wherever they go, I'm not here to host a revival of your church. I'm not to start new congregations. I'm not here to even defend Christianity. What I am here to do is hopefully educate those people within those doors to help them to stop harming people across the world in the name of progress, in the name of development, in the name of, what we would call colonization. That's one of the things that as I went through my education, I realized that what is being promoted is really what we would call a colonized version of Christianity, is what a lot of people understand. But in the teaching that I do, I call it an imperial version of Christianity, because it very much represents an era when the Christian faith was a part of a dictatorship, when it became a part of the Roman Empire and it became the state religion, that people really that was it. That's how you looked at things. And for us, when this faith came to this continent, we didn't have a choice. I tell people that when we look at some of the statistics of Indigenous populations, when the assimilation process took place, started when we were forcibly removed to Oklahoma, Trail of Tears stories, reservations were instituted, all of these things, we had already lost about 99.996% of our Indigenous population. So that means that all of these missionaries, all of these church officials were trying to convert and make salvageable human beings out of 0.004% of the survivors. And we haven't reconciled with that as a country. So I say all that because I still believe that the Christian faith is the one who perpetuates harm, partly because they do have a connection to governmental entities who justify what's happening to Indigenous peoples. And I do have that intimate knowledge. I've been to many places across the world where Indigenous peoples are continually being displaced, removed solely for the resources that are found in their ancestral domains and territories, similar to what we're even talking about here in the city of Atlanta in a way as well. So I sit there and I'm a part of it because I'm hoping that if people are given a chance to know how that violence is occurring, I hope and pray that we'll make the right choice to start making a move to end that violence. And even, I'm a part of some of our movements that is kind of, it's not just Muscogee Creek, but many tribal communities are a part of this movement of well-briety that talks about how do we heal from the trauma of all of this, the development of this country, displacement of peoples. And one of the concepts that is always taught in that is people don't know what they don't know. And I do believe that, history books haven't taught this history. Our schools haven't taught, some of this experiences of Native people. And so my hope is that through sharing, while there's still time, and I would have to unpack that comment as well, but while there's still time, that people will make the right decision once they've heard it, once they've met someone who's Indigenous. Just the other day, I was in Atlanta for an event for Emory University, and I was heading back to get ready to come back to Oklahoma. And I was in just a car service, and the driver said, "You are the first person in my 60 years of life that I have met that is a Native American person." And I sat there and we had a wonderful conversation. He was just inundating me with questions. But to think that in the year 2021, that in a place that at one time was 100% Indigenous, where the state of Georgia is, that someone would say that. And it wasn't antagonistic or bad. He was just, right. I think he was shocked that, that this was going on. And he was actually happy. He got, we were shaking hands and we were actually holding up traffic. I was wanting to take a selfie with him and, even, give him a flyer to our event coming up on Saturday to invite him out for more. But there was a whole line of cars behind us. And I just kind of looked back and said, I have to get out of the way. But that's kind of what we're up against. And so my hope that once people know, we can alter our way of existence. Once people are introduced to a more, we would commonly say a holistic way of living, but once we learn how to live in wellness with the diversity of humanity, wellness with the diversity of creation, we will stop doing violence to it. It won't be so easy to deforest, to just take down 400 acres of this country's largest urban forest is what we're trying to open our eyes up, because we all as human beings are dependent on clean air. We're all, and not just human beings, all of creation. We're dependent on clean water. We're dependent on the food that this Earth Mother provides for us, and so that's what I try to make sure that we are cognizant of that and live in wellness and balance of respecting that gift of life that is provided for us.
That's so great. Well, you mentioned the event on Saturday and you mentioned the forest south of Atlanta. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what that event is, what's the purpose of it, and what's your hope coming out of that?
Yeah. And I will be the first to say that over the past 3 months or so, I'm the one who's been inundated with the education. They're telling me this is what's going on and what's happening. So I almost feel like a novice, so to speak, some of the movements, because I know some of our community organizers have been active so long in trying to promote justice in the state of Georgia, in the Southeast, in the country, and especially in the city of Atlanta. So I was approached and they said, what would you be interested, in trying to do some cultural expressions for the greater community? And this has always been a dream of mine. At one time I was partially, I had an office with the Methodist Church that was located in the Midtown area of Atlanta. And, we worked with the DeKalb school system. We worked with some of the YMCA programs, different entities about educating them about Indigenous peoples. What we quickly realized is that the curriculum that was available always talked about Native peoples in the past tense. Mm. And so, we started that initiative because part of one of the work that we do within the United Methodist Church is we try to promote the elimination of Native American racial mascots. So like the Atlanta Braves, the Washington football team, right, that kind of thing. And so the understanding that I wanted to say is that, well, if we teach people, say here, here's a Native community now. Here are people that are living right in front of you. And while we are diverse in our understanding of such things as mascots, it's not appropriate. And so it was always been my dream to do something greater, bigger, to talk about, number one, that Native American people still have pieces of that cosmology, spirituality in existence today, and giving people an opportunity to even hear some of the things that we do, which the dance that we're going to actually be kind of showing everybody is actually a social part of our dancing. So it's the part after we've done some of our ceremonial things, and it's the part where we kind of do a more community-oriented. Visitors come in and we just share our expression of enjoying life. And so we'll get to see that on Saturday. And so my hope has always been to do something for the greater community. I've been on some of the campuses there, like at Emory and different ones, and I've talked to the student body. They've demonstrated a hunger to want to know more. And so my hope is to help to have a teaching moment, to share with the people, the visitors, whoever may be there, how we are intersected with some of the social justice initiatives, but also how we are intersected with communities of displacement who have been removed forcibly from their home territories. And so there's another side to that, which I'm also promoting. It's also this kind of, the terminology that I've been using is kind of a migration that's going to take place, of reconnecting our Muscogee people with their ancestral homelands. We've been so displaced for so many generations now, 4 to 5, that it's not within our consciousness anymore, that these are where our ancestors walked. And as you walk around and look at that portion of the state of Georgia, you realize why Indigenous peoples had trailways, had communication, had ways of living and existing in this whole area, because of the richness and the fullness of the land and territory. And, a lot of our people here in Oklahoma have been displaced from that. So my hope is that this will be the first step in reconnecting us to those territories of our ancestors, and even, assisting us in recognizing that it's just south of Atlanta. When we go to the Okmulgee Mountains, where the way that it was told to me is that our ancestors said that was the birthplace of Muscogee people. So, making sure that we even know about that. Even my own children, the first time they laid eyes on those mountains was only about 4 years ago. I would hope that as the moment we take our first breath, we would always have an understanding of where our homelands are. And even in a sense that can help us build our community stronger, that we always recognize why we're in Oklahoma too. So this event is kind of a twofold thing: educating the non-Native American community, sharing with them the importance of the forest. And even, I'm not shying away from the other social justice issues either. What does it mean when we see a militarized movement for a police force? I'm not afraid of speaking about that, because we know who's going to receive the brunt end of that equipment. It's going to be people of color. It's going to be used to displace people even more so, whether it's the houseless, whether it's marginalized communities. We're going to see that happening. And so, those are the things I'm there to stand in solidarity with our greater community, just as we promote, and this is the phrase that I use, just as we promote something as simple as the right to exist. The right to exist. When I say that, people kind of say, oh, is it really that simple? And in ways it is, because every person has a right to be self-determinate, to make the decisions of wellness that they think is best for their lives. But we all know, for those of us that have been marginalized in so many ways, generationally, that we haven't been given that. And, at this point, I don't even want to talk about what's happened in the past few days in terms of injustice in our country. I mean, it's almost like there's another chapter every 3 days of something going on that is forcing all of us who have a like-minded understanding of justice to just, all we can do is, pound the pavement to go and say, enough is enough. And so I stand in solidarity with those groups. And, to be honest, is that my hope and prayer with this event is that we'll walk away, those that who are able to witness it, will walk away with a more holistic understanding and realize that when we come in there and say, protect the forest, protect the water, end violence against people of color, we're not just talking about Native American and Indigenous children. We're talking about all of our children. We're talking about all of creation, that somehow we have to start minimizing and eliminating that violence that we have become so accustomed to, where, I'm thinking about, many years ago, whenever there was some type of, and I hate to use this as an example out of the reverence of the lives that were lost, but when we see someone who has brought weapons into a school system, that it made all of the news. Whenever there was something that happened in a mall, it made all of the news. And now we're getting to a place where now it's not even a mainline story. You look on your phones and you'll scroll and like, oh, are you kidding me? There was a shooting. And it's not even on your main cable news stations. It's not even garnering that attention. We've normalized it. How do we come back to normalizing life thriving? Everyone having the right to exist. And that's what my hope is that somehow, people will walk away with an understanding when they see this forest, when they see even the Ohochi River, that this is something that gives us life. And we have to make sure it's there for generations to come and not exploit it. So that's what my prayer is.
That's great. I mean, this whole effort to stop Cobb City, that movement, the efforts to protect the South River watershed and the South River forest, I mean, obviously it's been going on for a while. And as you said, there are all these intersections. There is, the theme that comes to mind is violence when you were talking about it. It's violence against the land, it's violence against people, whether it's, colonialism and disbursement and displacement kind of when that land was taken, but also every iteration of that land, pushing people out and now removing it to build a police training facility. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about those intersections, how those themes of violence against the land, but also police brutality and these sort of systems of institutionalized violence that we prop up intersect.
Mm-hmm. No, I'll start. It's kind of in an abstract way, but part of my office over the past few years, we've intersected and we've connected with Indigenous peoples worldwide. We've been a part of hosting different side events for the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. It's a place where internationally we recognize that what happened here in the United States is happening in many countries across the world in terms of displacement, manipulation, bribery, all kinds of stuff is going on. And one of the concepts now, I'm critical of it, but it's still a positive step, that they were trying to teach government entities, but also Indigenous peoples, to use this terminology of the FPIC, of free, prior, and informed consent, before any type of agreement with an extractive industry or a governmental entity would ever take place. And I'm like, yeah, cool. Come meet with us, come talk with our people, free, prior, and informed consent before you drill. Okay, that's good. But as I began to reflect upon it, that FPIC, FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, is not enough. Because now you need to add another letter to the end, free, prior, and informed consent. And then we need to teach them what to do when they are denied. Mm-hmm. When you hear the word no, just to accept that denial, to say, okay, you've told me no, so I will not go and try to purchase people who can advocate for us to be there. I will not go and hire paramilitary forces who will go and intimidate the community until they give in to what we want. If you don't think that's something we do, look at the entire Standing Rock situation. Yeah. I made footprints there on the Standing Rock homelands, and I saw for myself, these tanks, these armored soldiers, paramilitary. They weren't even a part of the police force, who were hired, private groups that were hired to come in. And even while I was there, I could not imagine these resources that they were using, when whatever they had, they forced the technology that we were carrying to turn off. Some of our cell phones, and that we were trying to document what was going on, everything turned off, and we were sitting like, what's going on? And like, our phones weren't even working. And some of the veterans that were there said, well, they're doing something, for whatever equipment they have over there. And I was shocked. And even while I was there with our elders, they asked me to come in and go into a sweat lodge ceremony with them and pray. And I said, I'd be happy to, I'm honored to. So we went in there to pray. And when they saw us going into this lodge, they brought helicopters that were swimming around the top. How does anyone have that type of resources to do such a thing? So I say all that because now we have to start pushing for that denial. When you hear the word no, no means no. And I use that on purpose, because the blunt terminology is, we have abused this earth, and we're still wanting to take everything that it can give us for so-called financial exploitation, and not realizing that we're jeopardizing the very existence right at this moment of our future generations, and even ourselves. I live here in central Oklahoma, in Moore, Oklahoma, where we've seen some of the largest tornadoes ever recorded in history that have happened because of climate change, because of the warming of the Gulf of Mexico and some of the currents that come through this part of the country, that people have already died from those enormous storms that sometimes we can't even predict them. I remember there was a smaller cyclone or tornado that came in from the north, which is not normal, and none of our sophisticated systems even knew about it. We looked out the window and everything was starting to shift, and like, oh, my son said, Dad, I think we need to take shelter. We didn't even know. And this was just, a few years ago, maybe 3 years ago. So no means no. And that's where I would start, because it connects to missing and murdered Indigenous women. It connects to our respect for the land. It connects to, all of these initiatives that we're being told aren't even connected, but they are, to the dehumanizing of Indigenous peoples, to saying something as simple as, we don't want to even have racial mascots in the sports arena. That whole dehumanizing process goes into all of this, because once we've said no, here comes the rhetoric of, well, this is what's best for all of us. Don't you want to have jobs? Don't you want development? Don't you want financial security? I once heard one of my relatives from the Pacific Islanders say, we've all but forgotten, like, everything on this island here, the most valuable thing, and he pointed over there, because it was in a place where, people were developing resorts, Walt Disney, all this kind of thing. He said, the most valuable thing here is this tree. It has more value than everything else. I sit there and I just stared at it, because that's it. That's how we need to understand the world. This water, this air, this tree, the things that have been graciously given to us to use to sustain life, we should respect that. And so my hope is that this world will start to understand, what does it mean to be denied that access? And if anything, what we're seeing is that what happens is that when a tribal community says no to extractive industries, people will start going to the politicians. They'll start redoing the laws. They'll start revamping everything, the procedures, and start going and going and going until they have their way. Yeah. And so that's what I say, is that when we hear the word no, No means no. Don't, we're thinking about everybody. A few years ago, we recorded a video there at the water treatment plant there in Atlanta, which is right there where the Standing Peachtree Village site is. It's all fenced in. And part of it was that we wanted to offer some community prayers, but also just recognize, we sent the video to the mayor's office and everything. We wanted people to know that we want this water to stay there for all the people of the metropolitan area. I forget how many, I think it was up in the millions of people it served every day. Water was taken from that river for the greater everybody in the metropolitan area of Atlanta. And so we offered the songs and prayers, and we made a video about it because we wanted people to realize, where would we be without it? Is that I half jokingly and half seriously challenge people to say that if we didn't have water to drink every day, would we live? And the answer is no, we wouldn't. Right. So my hope is that that's where we start. That's how we begin to share with people that once we enter these moments of just so-called discussion, that when we are told no, we understand its consequences. And hopefully there'll be a day when we don't have to go to the streets to protest. There'll be a day when we don't have to do sit-ins in the Bureau of Indian Affairs or state capitals across the country. There'll be a day when we can just say, no, we do not give approval for this movement, and we move on, and that's accepted.
Yeah. You have talked so many times about how, there's this whole other piece that's connected, about erasure. And it's, we erase people and culture and stories and histories by moving people, by not telling those stories. You mentioned kind of, we know in America all the gaps in our histories, the stories we choose not to tell, whether it's about Indigenous peoples who were here first, whether it's about slavery, whether, pick your thing. America doesn't really like to talk about those stories or deal with them in any kind of a way. And, the stomp dance happening on Saturday, obviously, the timing is important, and it is the timing of it being on Thanksgiving week is, I'm sure no coincidence, is connected to these sort of larger narratives about how we tell stories incorrectly. And so I'm wondering kind of this week, as people are celebrating a holiday that often people gives the permission for people to wipe over a lot of history. And also, you're having this stomp dance to draw attention to the things happening in the South River Forest. I wonder if you could just talk about, the connections between those things and how you're thinking about that.
No, I think there's a couple of things that we're adding to the energy of doing it around the Thanksgiving holiday. I have to confess, though, and I do this kind of jokingly, that for when I was approached by community leaders at the possibility of coming out, I cannot do anything without my family, my son, my daughters. Two of them are college aged, and they're the ones that actually said, well, Dad, our break's coming up in November, and we'll be home, and we can probably do it then. But then I said, oh, that's the Thanksgiving holiday. And I looked at the representatives that were talking to me, and I said, what would it be like if we did some type of action, direct action to raise that awareness and that consciousness about this fictitious history that we teach. And I say fictitious because even just yesterday, my second grade son came home with all of these lessons that he had past week about what is the first Thanksgiving. And it's the same thing that we know, the stereotypical, here's the Pilgrims, here's the Indians, let's color them. I think even there's been times when kids will run out of the school with the little Pilgrim hats on. And even some today in Oklahoma, even some come out with their fictitious construction paper headdresses on with the feathers and things of that nature. I've continually met with our school systems here in central Oklahoma about the elimination of that, but it's just nonstop. Columbus Day, Thanksgiving, and here in Oklahoma, the land run where they opened up reservation territories for free so-called settlement. All these things, we're just bombarded, and we try to do our best to advocate for change. So that was one of the ideas, is that maybe we can do something to counter, popular culture's teaching about, our presence here. And as this event began to unfold and we began to talk about it, I quickly realized, because really I'm accustomed to, I've been in refugee camps across the world. I was at Standing Rock, this kind of thing. But when my family's with me, it's a little bit different. And so this began to evolve into a family experience. And to be honest, I'm okay with that, because I really value and prioritize teaching our children. Because my hope is that if we can begin to teach them that truth and undo the normalizing of the silencing of the history of Indigenous peoples, we can make a new normalizing program of acknowledging the history of Indigenous peoples in this country, that they will, over the years, begin to mature into persons who have a well-rounded understanding of history, and the world will automatically be a better place. And so that's kind of what I said, well, this still serves that purpose. I told the organizers that, I said, no matter what, these songs that these trees at one time heard will hear again. The language that was at one time the dominant language of this entire region that the city of Atlanta is in will hear that language again. And there will be an impact from it, whether it's an energy that will support the work of justice, the work of balance, the work of preservation of the forest. It will help that. And that's my belief. And so I'm actually thankful that we have this opportunity, because I really want to do more. I have a relationship with Emory. I'm hoping that to do one of these in the coming years for the student body there, and even been asked by current students that what will it take to get you back here to do something like this. So I'm hoping that as time goes on, this will just be the first of many events that help us to acknowledge Indigenous peoples, but also acknowledge how does it intersect with so many justice movements, other communities of color all across the country who are doing this work. I think that's what we're starting to see, that energy start to percolate. And even I'm starting to get more emails and things. Well, what about this? You need to talk to so-and-so. And I'm almost kind of overwhelmed, like, oh, give me a second to digest everything. And I don't know how much time we have, but I want to share this last story.
Of course, go ahead.
To talk about this normalizing of the silencing of histories. One day we're all pretty familiar with Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. And there, I believe it's between concourses B and C in the tunnel area where you can walk on the people movers, that we have this enormous display of a walk through the city of Atlanta, I think is what it's called. And it talks about the birth of the city. It begins with William McIntosh, of course. I don't want to go into great detail about that, but the Reconstruction period, Civil War, it goes through all of these things. But on one side, there's an acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples. And when I first saw this massive, it's a good football field long of exhibition, I saw that there was a panel that included Indigenous peoples. And I was actually pretty excited. I was, oh man, I got my phone. I think I was taking pictures of it, maybe even a selfie. They've included Native peoples. And that's not usually the case, historically. And so I was actually excited. But then I think a couple months later, as I was going to, traveling from home to somewhere else, I looked at the dates that were included on the panel. And in that one panel, like I said, this entire display is like a football field long. On this one panel was several thousand years of history and existence smashed into one. And on the rest of the exhibit, it encapsulated just over 200 years of existence. Right there is how we normalize the silencing of a history, because we put thousands and thousands of years of Indigenous people's existence in this one small area. I've even shared with folks from our communities that they say that human inhabitation in those Muscogee Mountains just south of Atlanta, in that area alone, has been around 14,000 years, human inhabitation. And when I think about, well, let's compare that to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
This country is just around 245 years old. It's in its infancy. So that's how we've normalized that silencing. And my hope is that through conversations just like this, and I wish I had coffee too. I sat there and just maybe tea, some hot tea, but through sharing just like this, it will alter our existence so that we will now remove that silencing. We will put in place a new normalizing, a normalizing of inclusivity, a normalizing of working for justice, a normalizing of not discounting pain when it's expressed to us, so that, you know, whatever faith community we come from, whatever walk of life that we're a part of, we have that right to exist.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, and thank you for participating and bringing about this beautiful stomp dance that's going to happen on Saturday. And everyone, again, you can find the information for that in the description of this video. Please, please, please show up on Saturday and stand in solidarity with the people there who are trying to protect the forest and the watershed, and tell some of these stories that don't get told. There's also a link to support the movement financially in the description of this video as well. So please consider making a gift to support the efforts around protecting the forest. Reverend Chebon, before I let you go, I wanted to circle back to something you said, because I think it's probably a good way to end. You, in the beginning, talked a lot about time, while we have the time. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to speak to that as we close out here.
No, and let me first and foremost that, you know, I promote our life and our wellness. I see the goodness in all of us, despite, you know, some of the events of this world. But when I say, I use kind of that understanding is that I don't know if we'll have enough time. Is one that this country has taken its toll on Indigenous peoples. You know, the assimilation process that was instituted in the 19th century is actually taking hold now. When we think about the loss of language, when we think about the loss of understanding our identity as Indigenous peoples, is that we're on the cusp of not having either one of those concepts anymore. And so my hope and prayer is that I will do everything in my power to be a promoter, and even the terminology I've used or I've seen used is defender of our way of life, to teach our children that those generations that are yet to come will always have this way of life that's been here for, you know, for millennia. So that's kind of one of the ways I understand it, you know, if we don't, when I say we may not have enough time. You know, this pandemic has taken its toll on some of our elders in our community. We've lost so many first language speakers. I've seen it. I've assisted in some of the funerals of our elders, you know, over this past year. But then also, there's a double meaning as well, is that we haven't come to terms that climate change is already here. Climate change is already altering our way of existing. We have Indigenous peoples. I was just on a call with one of our youth groups from the Pacific. We had about 50 people that were talking about, you know, they asked me to talk about climate change and Indigenous peoples. And, you know, they're already experiencing rising sea levels at this moment. Members here in the United States, the Houma community in Louisiana, are already experiencing rising sea levels that are now creeping into their homelands, forcing them to remove. We have Alaskan villages of First Nations peoples who are having to remove their village too because of the warming, the melting of, you know, the snow and ice, that the seasons aren't normal anymore. And what I shared earlier in the podcast is that, you know, even here in my home that I've had to call my home, we have these enormous, you know, storms that are coming through, that it never used to be this frequent to have so many, you know, every 4 or 5 years, this massive tornado cyclone that comes through. it's already taken lives. This is something that, we can't even, they had to develop new measuring mechanisms to count how big it was, how forceful it was. We've already lost lives to that. We've already lost lives to climate change. So that's what I say. That's what I mean is like, I pray, they just ended the COP26 gatherings in Glasgow. I think a week and a half ago, maybe 2 weeks ago now. I hope those leaders take seriously, that we have to make massive alterations to our existence. And that's something I try to do, and I try to do it the best I can. Every time I'm asked to travel and get on a plane, I make sure it's going to be for the perpetuation of that agenda that I carry. Every time that I, turn on that car vehicle, is it necessary for me to even leave my home at this point or walk? And that's something that we as a country have to come to terms with. So that's what I say when I say, I pray that we have enough time.
Thank you so much for making some time to come on this episode of Coffee and Something Stronger. And everyone who's watching, thank you for tuning in, and please show up on Saturday and help support this ongoing work. Again, this will be the first step of a lot of steps in protecting that forest. Thanks so much.